Okay, so let's continue our discussion. In the last video, I talked about the principle of sufficient reason. I explained what I exactly mean by that. So to recap, what we mean by principle of sufficient reason is, or at least the way that I define it, is that if I have something that is logically possible for it to be different from what it is in any aspect, then we require an explanation. There must be something to explain why it is in this specific configuration rather than the other one. What activated this specific position than the other ones. So as for example, if I have a glass of water, it's in a specific position. If it is logically possible for it to be in a different position, why is it that it is at this moment at this position? What explains the activation or the actualization of this specific position than the other possibilities? I have black hair. For me as a human being, it is possible to have a different color. Why is that? Because I see other human beings who have a different hair color. So why is it that I have a black hair? What activated this color? What is the cause or the mechanism behind it that explains the actualization of this specific color? All right, so that's the principle of sufficient reason, right? As I also explained, this is not something that I'm just going to assert, say, hey, this is true, this has to be true. This is just an assumption that we have, and the only reason that I accept it is because if I don't accept it, then it's very difficult for me to live consistently. So if someone says, hey, I don't believe in that principle, I'm like, okay, I mean, it's fine. But just show me how you would act consistently. And there will be so many questions regarding to it. Again, it's not really important for me, the specific proposition, but the consistency of the situation is much more important. All right, so now after that, so that would be our first assumption in the argument that we will be discussing today. Again, it will not be probably the whole argument, but at least part of it. So as you know, the cosmological arguments are usually divided into two parts. The first part, where you conclude with the existence of something like a necessary being, something similar to it. And then in the second part, you start trying at least to explain why that necessary being is something that deserves the name God, that it's something that we can actually recognize as God. So I will use the same template, and I will start with the first part today, and we'll see how it goes. All right, so the first assumption is the principle of sufficient reason, and the second assumption is that something exists and that doesn't require any form of justification, because the only way that someone can say that I don't believe in that assumption that something exists is to say that nothing exists. And we all agree that this is not nothingness. Something is. If someone comes along and says, I don't believe that nothing exists, I can just easily ignore that objection, because as his position, he doesn't exist and his objection doesn't exist. So there cannot be any objection to this assumption. All right, so something exists and we have the principle of sufficient reason. So the way I move is like this. I start asking questions about that one thing. And you see that we are talking in a completely general sense. I'm not even claiming what a thing is, even metaphysically. I don't need to. It's so general, these two principles, that I don't need to even specify what I mean by that. I guess it would work in any kind of definition that you work with, Whatever you have in your mind. you know something exists, I know something exists, and I also accept the principle of sufficient reason. All right, so what I start doing is by looking at that thing that we're assuming in that thing's existence. So the existence of that thing, I'm trying to look at that. And I start asking this question: is it logically possible for that thing to not be? Now the answer is either yes or no. If the answer is no, that it's not logically possible for that thing to not be, then I have reached the conclusion of this part. I want to show in the end that there exists at least one thing that it is impossible for it, that is logically impossible for it to not exist. So if that first thing that we talked about, if someone says, yeah, that's the thing, okay, then you can skip to the end of the story, at least to the end of this part. So we will continue along the line that the answer is yes. So we have something. Is it logically possible for that thing to not exist? Yes. The principle of sufficient reason kicks in. We need an explanation for that. Why is it that this thing that is possible for it to not be is right now? Now, is it possible? Now, as we go along, then you will start to see some other assumptions creeping into my discussion. And it's exactly the same with the first two assumptions that I made explicitly clear. I'm not really, again, pushing with these assumptions. They're still open to debate. And if someone says, hey, we don't have to agree with that, that's fine. Again, it's about consistency. If you can build a system consistent with these, with not accepting these propositions, then that's fine too. So the question is it possible for the explanation of that thing existence to be itself? So we have something and it is possible for it to not be, and we require an explanation, and then we say, okay, that thing itself is the explanation for its existence. Is that possible? I believe that it is not, because if something is the explanation of its own existence, then I believe that thing should be necessary. Because think about it. I mean, if something is an explanation, if it wants to be an explanation for the existence of something else, it has to have a kind of ontological priority to that thing. So if something is the explanation for its own existence, then it means that it has to exist in some sense before it exists. Because it has to activate its own existence. So it has to exist before it exists to be able to activate. That's why I'm saying that it has to be ontologically prior, because if you want to activate that specific actuality, then you need to be, in a sense, before that. Not in time, but in existence, ontologically. So if something is the explanation of its own, then I would say that it is actually a necessary thing. So it wouldn't be contingent. By contingent, I mean something that is possible for it to not be. Okay, so that's another assumption that I'm bringing in, that it cannot be the explanation of its own existence. We can think about that, whether that actually leads to a necessary being or not, but I'm aware of that. We can talk about that later too. So if we accept that it cannot be, if it is a contingent thing, as we're assuming here, right? Because the answer to that question was yes. it cannot be the explanation or the cause of its own existence. So we immediately get to this conclusion that there must be something else too. So that thing that we assumed in the beginning that exists, that's not the only thing. Because we know that it is possible for it to not be, and if it is possible for it to not be, it has to have an explanation. And if it is a contingent thing, it cannot be the explanation of its own existence, so there must be something else too. So there is something, and then we have something else that activates the existence of this thing. So now I ask the same question of this second thing. Is it possible for it to not exist? The answer is yes or no. If it's no, then that's the necessary thing that I'm looking for. We can skip to the end of the argument. If the answer is yes, then I'm going to do the same thing. I'm looking for another explanation, which it cannot be its own, right? And then we can get this chain. And here comes the next assumption in, or the next proposition that I have here, that this chain cannot go forever. This cannot be an infinite chain, and it cannot be a circle. It has to end in an element, in a thing. There must be an initial point to this chain, or some kind of primary elements to this chain. So even if we say the chain is infinite, somehow it has to have a primary element in it. Why is that? Why can this chain go up to infinity? Okay, so what is this chain exactly? We're asking for the explanation of the existence of, let's say, my glass, right? The glass of water that I have. I assume that, okay, it's possible for it to not be, to continue the argument. And based on the principle of sufficient reason, I need an explanation for that. And if this chain can go to infinite, what it means is that when I ask for the explanation of that glass, the explanation is passed on to the next element. Why? Because at each point of this chain, if I remove one of those chains, if any of the elements in this chain is gone, everything above it also is gone. And by gone, I mean it loses its explanatory power. Why? Because something has to exist to have an explanatory power. But the existence of these links themselves depend on the previous link. So if A has an explanatory power, it's because it exists. And that is because of C. And that is because of D. And if you get D, then you have no explanation for C, which means you have no explanation for B, which means you have no explanation for A. Again, why can this chain go to infinite? Because each chain gets its explanatory power from the previous chain. And if we assume, which we do, that we do have an explanation, then that means that this chain, if this chain goes up to infinite, we really don't have an explanation. That's like saying, that's like if I ask you what is, like you're asking me, what is a number 1? And I tell you, okay, to understand number 1, and I'm not talking the actual number 1, I'm just saying something that I labeled with 1. If I tell you to understand number 1, you have to understand number 2. And then you say, okay, then what's 2? And then I say, okay, to understand 2, you have to understand 3. And if you want to understand 3, you need to understand 4. See, so like 3 has an explanatory power for 2, but 3 itself requires an explanation due to 4. So if we do have an explanation for 1, this chain must come to an end, because otherwise what we are saying is that If I keep doing this, if I say, okay, you want to know 1, you need to know 2. If you want to know 2, you want to need 3. If I keep doing this forever, then somehow I will know what 1 is. But think about it. How's that possible? Okay, if this were like a definition, I'm looking for a definition of 1, and let's say that's dependent on 2, and 2 dependent on 3, and then you're asking, okay, what's 4? That's 5. What is 5? That's 6. And you're telling me that if I go forever, then I would be like, oh, okay, now I know what 1 is. That doesn't make sense to me. Because remember, from principle of sufficient reason, we have this assumption that there is an explanation. So something right now exists that explains that thing, the existence of that thing, that it is possible for it to not be. There is something right now. So that chain must come to an end, because otherwise this explanation will never happen. The A will not be explained. It will pass to B, B will pass to C, C will pass to D. It will just keep going. Let me give you another example to know exactly what I mean. Like if I ask you, okay, what is the explanation for my hair being black? And then you tell me, okay, the explanation is because, there's a specific protein in your body that generates this color. And I tell you, yeah, of course, I know that. My question is, why is that? Like, why is that protein in me different? Why is it not activated in a different way? And then you're like, oh, okay, it's because of your genes, And I'm like, dude, like I know, I've studied genetics. I know that my genes are different, but why is that? And then you give something else. I'm like, I know that, but why is that? If you keep passing this on, you're basically postponing the explanation. And if I postpone the explanation infinitely far away, it will not explain the first element. We don't somehow come to an explanation. We don't come to an understanding of that first thing if I never get to a satisfactory explanation. Just going this forever will never solve this problem. And the same thing also if you create a loop, Creating a loop is much worse because of that thing that you have to be prior to yourself. So creating a loop is basically, again, A is before B, A is before B is before A, and C is before B, and then A is before C, which would lead to this weird conclusion that A is somehow before A, leading to the necessary existence of A. It's just a extended loop, I would say. So and also in terms of explanation, again, just going around the circle, like what is 1? You say, okay, you have to understand 2. How do I understand 2? You have to understand 3. Okay, but how do I understand the existence of 3? You have to understand the existence of 1. But that was exactly the question that I started with. What is the explanation of 1? And now you just went through a loop and came back to the 1 again. So if I'm assuming that the existence of the glass of water that I have has an explanation, which is our assumption, then this loop or this chain must come to an end. So that's the fourth assumption that I have. Again, if someone wants to say, hey, I don't agree with that, it's completely fine. Just behave consistently and you will be fine. I can't. I mean, if I cannot really square these two things together. Like that comfort, that reality that I know, okay, there is an explanation right now. There exists something there. If I'm assuming that, I cannot square that with an infinite link or a loop or something. So that's the next assumption. That's not possible to happen. Okay. So to recap, we have the principle of sufficient reason. 2, something exists. 3, if something is the explanation for its own existence, then it's a necessary being. 4, the chain of these explanations for the existence of things cannot go forever. So this chain has an end. The conclusion is that end, that linking end, which we just proved that it exists, it is impossible for it to not be. Why? Because if it were possible for it to not be, then it would require an explanation. It would require another link in that chain, which is in contradiction with the assumption that it is the last link. So if this link comes to an end, which we show that it will, is our assumption, then that thing cannot not be. It's logically impossible for it to not be. And that's not the complete first part, but that's a segment of the first part, the way that I put it. Usually that's the whole thing for the first part, but I extended in my mind, I extended the first part. So we come to the conclusion that if the existence of my cup has an explanation, therefore there exists at least one thing that it is logically impossible to not be, and that's a necessary being. Okay, we still have a long road to get to something that is deserved to be named God. But still, I just want to I guess I will finish the video with this segment, but I will continue the argument in other videos. But even right now, I guess it's worth considering the whole argument. And I believe this is a part that not many people would find controversial. It's not that difficult to see that, there are things that are necessary. Or at least the argument is pretty simple. There's not much controversy around the assumptions. But even here, I guess it's worth looking into the conclusion. Because what we're saying is that if our assumptions are true, if they hold, then there is something, at least there is one thing in this world that it is logically impossible for it to not be. And that's a very weird notation. Like, it's a very interesting conclusion. Like, we've proven that something is absolutely impossible to not be. You see, we're not talking about things that are there forever, Like, some things can be there forever. Like, religious people believe in angels, right? And angels are forever. And they're created, but they're forever. People used to believe that the universe, and they still do, that the universe is forever. It doesn't have a beginning or an end. But that's not the same thing as being logically impossible to not be. Because even though something might endure in this universe, the fact that it's logically impossible, it means that any world that you can imagine, any possible world that you can imagine, this thing has to be in it. If it's not, then you're being logically inconsistent. That's a very interesting thing. I would really love to understand what that thing is. Like, imagine that it's like a fundamental particle or a field or the initial conditions of the universe or whatever. It's something that is logically impossible to not be. It's a strange thing. It's not yet really weird because it can be more than one. But in the next video, I will try to argue why it has to be one. And then it gets really interesting. Because then we would have this one thing. It will become very special. This one thing that is impossible for it to not be. Not just that it just happened to endure forever and ever and ever. No, we're talking about logic. We're talking about logical impossibility of it. So that's quite interesting. So I will finish this part. It's a rather straightforward argument up to now. I believe 4 assumptions I had. Open to discussion. It's, as I said in the beginning, it's just a philosophical investigation together. So let me know what you think, and then I will see you in the next video. Thank you.